Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Mainstream Indie Music channel. On this channel, we talk everything indie music, even pop punk music as well. And this week's episode is one of our What If episodes. We have done them in the past. Simply, what happens is we take a musical event that happened in the indie rock era, in the pop punk era, really any kind of era, and we swap outcomes. Usually it involves two bands. Sometimes it might involve multiple band members. This is our third episode of doing so. And this one's interesting because when you hear these two bands together, you might not think, or you might wonder, how these two bands even crossed paths to begin with, and if they did. Almost as if, would an outcome like this even be possible? And the answer is yes, which of course I'll get to why we can say so in a little bit. But first, setting it up. Panic at the Disco, if you don't know who they are, who are they? Well, they are a pop punk band from the early 2000s that was discovered by Patrick Stump and Pete West in their Decadence and the Fueled by Ramen kind of days. They found them while on tour and decided that Panic at the Disco had a lot of potential, specifically amongst its two band members, Brandon, of course, the lead singer, and its other band member as well, Ryan Ross. Now, at the same time, let's take the other band for just a second, then we're going to jump back to Panic at the Disco. The Hush Sound. Who were the Hush Sound? Well, the Hush Sound was another pop punk band from the early 2000s in the Midwest. They were also discovered by Pete Wentz and Patrick Stump. Now, the interesting thing about the Hush Sound is they were very, very young. They were almost fresh out of high school when they were found by, the said members of Fall Out Boy. But of course, who would turn that down, especially having that amount of support? And so they went on tour with Fall Out Boy, and they went on tour with Panic at the Disco as well at the same time. But let's not get into so much what happened in real life. That's just kind of setting up the story so far and how all three of these bands crossed paths. And so, of course, in real life, the story pans out with Panic at the Disco becoming the major favorite and becoming one of the most popular bands of pop punk of the early 2000s, and the Hush Sound sadly never really gaining a lot of traction. And so, what if during this time period, these two paths cross differently? Let's start with Panic at the Disco first, then we are going to go into the Hush Sound next. And so, Panic at the Disco, what happened is, in this Universe B scenario, Panic at the Disco starts off good, just like how we set it up. They start touring with Fall Out Boy. They start achieving some success, and so they don't want to stop, right? They want to just keep on going. And so what happens is Panic at the Disco releases their second album, Pretty Odd. I'm going to keep this, I guess you could say, function of the story the same, where Ryan Ross wanted to go a different direction musically and went with the sound of the Pretty Odd album. As you may know of, that album's sound was completely different than it was from its predecessor, A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, and many fans noticed that. Not many of the fans were very happy about that change as well. And so, with such a drastic change of sound and the kind of bad fallout that came from it, Panic at the Disco split in half, just like they did in real life, right? With Ryan Ross and John Walker leaving, and Brandon Urie and the drummer Spencer going their own direction as well. However, all of that drama within the band, the change of musical tone, definitely took a hit on Panic at the Disco. But even with that hit, they decided to release their third album, Vices and Virtues. However, all of the aforementioned obstacles were just too much for Panic at the Disco to overcome. All of the infighting, all of the drama surrounding the sound of the band, even though they had almost done a return to form, still was just not enough for people to keep listening. And sadly, Panic at the Disco's career ends there after their third album. Brendon Urie does try to start up other bands, trying to recapture the magic from the first album, but is never really successful at doing so. Maybe at times he teams up with Fall Out Boy, but sadly in this Universe B, Brendon Urie and Panic at the Disco's story just kind of ends there. And so now let's take it with the second half of the video. What happens with the Hush Sound? What do they do? Well, in this scenario, they had released their first album, of course, touring with, as I mentioned, Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco. But then they make a huge break with their second album. The second album was called Like Vines, and their big single, We Intertwined, is a massive pop punk anthem from the early 2000s. I almost like to think of the song We Intertwined like Panic at the Disco's song 9 in the Afternoon. Think that amongst popularity, kind of the impact on the pop punk movement and songs at the time. Now, this was definitely noticed by fans, as that album also had other hits such as Sweet Tangerine and Dark Congregation, amongst others. Now, what was happening was many fans were starting to notice Greta's contribution to the band, her voice, her songwriting, her music playing, and she was really starting to stand out as the star. Inasmuch so, they decided to still move forward with their third album, Goodbye Blues. This, again, was met amongst fans and highly, highly regarded. But what was especially noticed on that album, again, was the star power of Greta amongst the other three band members. In so much, a lot of people started to say that she would be better off almost leaving the Hush Sound behind so that she could focus on a solo career and maybe kind of grow wings and go off on her own, which is exactly what she did. After the third Hush Sound album, she went off, and I would say that her star power became one of the other pop punk queens like Hayley Williams, and she dominated that era. Greta was also known to be amongst one of the most popular faces of the pop punk movement of the early 2000s. However, she was not just happy with that. She had no bad blood amongst her bandmates, and in fact, even though Bob was just as competent of a writer and kind of stayed with the Fueled by Ramen label, she thought to herself that she should go back and the Hush Sound should rise again, which is exactly what they did. And so after about a 5-year or so hiatus, they came back with the album 45 as a reunion album. Ironically, at the same time as Fall Out Boy was doing their reunion as well. And so both bands decided to team up and tour together as kind of a reunion tour, even making their sales even higher and pushing themselves amongst stardom in the early to mid 2000s now, maybe even to the 2010s. And just like Fall Out Boy is known today, the Hush Sound stayed many more albums later. It's almost like she got that out of her system working alone and she regrouped. And so the Hush Sound became one of the biggest pop punk bands of that time period. What do you guys think after both of these stories? I want to hear your opinion. Do you think that's how it would have played out? Do you think that Panic at the Disco's split as a band would have actually led to their band completely going away? Do you think the Hush Sound had the chops musically to become one of the biggest bands of the early to mid 2000s and 2010s? I want to hear from y'all. What theories do you have if these two bands kind of switch fates? And I will talk to y'all later. Peace and have a very good week.